Another issue related to that, which I guess leads us into the Ukraine issue, is the nuclear issue. But what's your view on that? Have your views evolved on nuclear?
No, I mean, my views have always been the same. If they can make it safe and if they can make it economic. Right now, it is literally the most expensive way to boil a pot of water that has ever been devised. We were told that nuke energy would be too cheap to meter, and actually, it is. It's so expensive that no utility in the world will build a nuclear power plant without vast public subsidies by the taxpayer. And then look at Fukushima. Look at what is happening there now. There is so much water, contaminated water, that is pouring out and contaminating the entire Pacific Ocean. They're finding those radiation and fishes all over the ocean, and the only solution is for them to pump the water into these huge tanks and then store it forever. And if you go look at the pictures of Fukushima now, there are these giant, vast tanks that just go on as far as the eye can see. Look at Chernobyl. Now, you may say, well, there's new forms of nuke power that are safer, which I would say is not true, but don't listen to me. Listen to the insurance industry. Listen to AIG and Lloyd's of London and ask them, would you ever insure one of these plants? And they won't. So, until they can buy an insurance policy, they shouldn't be saying it's safe. Buying insurance in our country, they had to go in a sleazy legislative maneuver in the middle of the night and pass the Price-Anderson Act, which shifts the burden of their accidents onto the public.
One thing that you talk about a lot in your interviews, in your speeches, is America being in a permanent state of war and how you want to put an end to that. With regard to Ukraine, how do you propose to do that?
Settle it. I mean, the Russians have repeatedly offered to settle, and particularly, if you look at the Minsk Accords, which the Russians, offered to settle for, that looks like a really good deal today. Oh, it's. I mean, let's be honest. This is a U.S. war against Russia for geopolitical reasons, and to essentially sacrifice the flower of Ukrainian youth in an abattoir of death and destruction for the geopolitical ambition of the neocons, off-stated, of deposing of regime change for Vladimir Putin and of exhausting the Russian military so that they can't fight anywhere else in the world. And and President Biden has said that was his intention, to depose, to get rid of Vladimir Putin. His Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, in April 2022 said, our purpose here is to exhaust the Russian army. Well, what does that mean, exhaust? It means throwing Ukrainians at them. Right now, Russians are killing Ukrainians at a ratio of either 1 to 5 or 1 to 8, depending on what data you believe.
If you became president, you would inherit the situation as it is. So although there might be missteps in the past that you regret, the situation as it is, that both sides are very dug in. Public opinion in most of Ukraine is now very violently against Russia and vice versa. There is a front. What would the policy actually be to basically say territory that Russia has already conquered they can keep? And you would then be accused of surrendering?
Well, what I'm accused of is irrelevant to me, as you may have figured out by now. Let's do what's sensible, no matter what I'm accused of. Let's do what makes sense, what saves lives. This was supposed to be a humanitarian mission. That's how they sold it to us in the United States. But that would imply that the purpose of the mission was to reduce bloodshed and to shorten the conflict. And every step that we've taken has been to enlarge the conflict and to maximize bloodshed. That's not what we should be doing. If you look at the Minsk Accords, it sets the groundwork for a final settlement. In the Minsk Accords, the Donbass region, which is 80% ethnic Russian, and Russians that were being systematically killed by the Ukrainian government, would become autonomous within Ukraine and would be protected. And I would say, let's protect those populations with a United Nations force or whatever we have to do to make sure the bloodshed stops. In addition to that, we need to remove our Aegis missile systems from which can house the Tomahawk missile, which is a nuclear missile 70 miles from the Russian border. When the Russians put nuclear missiles in Cuba, 1,500 miles from Washington, D.C., we were ready to invade them, and we would have evaded them if they hadn't removed them. So, and the way they got removed ultimately is my uncle and father made a deal with Ambassador Dobrynin and Khrushchev, who they had a close relationship with and they could talk directly to at that point. And they said, the deal was, we will remove our Jupiter missiles from Turkey on your border because we know that's intolerable to you. Russia's been invaded twice in the previous 100 years with the vast cost that we can't even comprehend in the United States. And one could see why they wouldn't want U.S. nuclear missile systems in hostile countries on their border. We should also agree to keep NATO out of the Ukraine. I don't think the neocons are capable of settling it, and the people who surround President Biden, I don't think they're capable of, because they were the ones who created the problems, and I don't think they'll ever recognize that. And by the way, I am not excusing or justifying Vladimir Putin's barbaric and illegal invasion of the Ukraine. I'm just saying we need to figure out a way. My uncle always said, if you want to actually achieve peace, you've got to put yourself in the other guy's shoes, and you got to figure out the pressures, the local pressures on him too. My uncle, while he was surrounded by Joint Chiefs of Staff, by an intelligence apparatus that was trying to get him to go to war. And the fact that there was one confrontation where the Russian ship that was carrying supplies to Cuba stopped before it hit the kind of the embargo wall of U.S. Ships. That wasn't the end of the crisis. That was just a midpoint, and it could have gone anywhere from there. And the end of the crisis happened because my uncle reached out to Khrushchev directly and said, let's settle this between ours. And their settlement was secret, and it remained secret for many years. But my uncle wanted to settle it, and he understood that he had to put himself in Khrushchev's position, and that Khrushchev didn't want war, and neither did he. But they were both surrounded by people who did want to go to war. We made a commitment to Russia, to Gorbachev, that we would not move NATO 1 inch to the east. So, then we went into 13 NATO countries. We put missile systems in with nuclear capacity. If you're addressing Russia hostilely from the beginning, of course, their reaction is going to be a hostile reaction back. And we know what happened in the Ukraine. The U.S. Supported essentially a coup d'etat in 2014 against the democratically elected government of Ukraine. And we put in place, and we now have, the telephone call transcripts. Victoria Nuland, one of the neocons in the White House then, handpicking the new cabinet that was hostile to the Soviet Union. So, I think we have to put ourselves in the shoes of our opponents. And it doesn't mean saying that Vladimir Putin is not a gangster. He is. That he's not a thug. He is. That he's not a bully. He is. But going to war is not in his interest either. And he repeatedly told us, these are red lines you're crossing.
Should we take it from what you're saying that in practice, that means your support for NATO as president would be different?
That is something that I'm going to look at as president. I'm going to look at how do we de-escalate tensions between the great powers, between China, between the United States and Russia. And, how do we let these countries deal with their neighbors in a way without pressure from the United States that makes them feel like they're going to have to go into a military mode. And I'm not saying that's what happened here. I'm saying that's something that we need to look at. And the reason that we need to look at that is we have institutional problems in our country where and this might something my uncle discovered in 1961, when he said what he realized during the Bay of Pigs crisis is that the CIA had devolved into an agency whose function was to provide the military-industrial complex with a constant pipeline of new wars. And my uncle came out of one of those meetings as the Bay of Pigs invasion collapsed, and he realized the CIA had lied to him, and he fired ultimately Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, Charles Cabell, Richard Bissell, the three top people of the CIA, for lying to him. But he said at that time, I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. We have to recognize that, it's not just our civilian agencies that have been captured by industry. The military agencies, the Pentagon, and particularly the intelligence agencies have been captured by the military-industrial complex. And, and we have to recognize that, and we have to say, okay, we don't want constant wars in our country. We can't afford them. I think the CIA needs to be reorganized in a way. Most of the people who work at the CIA are patriotic Americans. They're very, very good public servants, and we need them to function. But I think we really need to separate the espionage functions of that agency and the plans division, the division that actually does dirty tricks, that kills people, that makes wars, that involves itself in actions, because what happens is that tail, the operations tail, begins to wag the espionage dog. The term espionage means basically information gathering and analysis, and that is the function that we want, that the CIA was created to perform. And very, very early on, Alan Dulles essentially corrupted the purpose of it by getting the CIA involved in assassinations and fixing elections. And the CIA has been involved now in coup d'etats or attempted coup d'etats in about a third of the countries in the world, most of them democracies. So our national policy as a country is to promote democracy. The CIA's policy has been the opposite, and it has been at odds with the United States. And I think part of that, my father recognized this too. His plan was to reorganize the CIA along those lines, to separate the espionage and the analysis and information gathering functions from the black functions, because otherwise the espionage section sees its job as justifying all of these these nefarious activities they're involved in, and there's no accountability. Unfortunately, we have a 60-year war with Iraq, and that war began when the CIA overthrew the first democratically elected government in the 6,000-year history of Persia. And we are still living with the blowback from that operation. And there's no accountability, and these agencies need to be accountable. And I would break up the CIA in a way that would make them accountable.